Villains are always more interesting characters. It's very hard to make good people interesting. It's undoubtedly easier and more fun to hold folly and vice up to ridicule than it is to present goodness and say, isn't that wonderful? Why don't you all be that way? Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven.
The Durango 95 purred away real horror show. A nice, warm, vibrating feeling all through your gutty woods. Soon it was trees and dark, my brothers.
Stanley didn't think of Clockwork Orange as specific to England at all. I know it was all English film, but he didn't. Nothing in the film says it couldn't happen in any country. I think it was a film about what was going on all over the Western world, and the phenomenon of what happened to young hippies and children. It was very clear that things were changing enormously. And so, yes, it was a film of its time, but not of that country only.
Once upon a time, in 1971, there was a film, Stanley Kubrick's ninth feature, A Clockwork Orange. In the not-too-distant future, young Alex, who adores Beethoven, and his gang of droogs from the Korova Milk Bar set out together for a night of ugly, ultra-violent fun, beating up on an old tramp, breaking into the country home of a writer and forcing him to watch as they rape his wife, murdering a wealthy old woman who lives alone with her cats. In prison, Alex is subjected to the experimental Ludovico technique, a brainwashing system which makes sex and violence disgusting to him. Released, he's defenseless. He discovers his parents have replaced him with an adopted son. His victims are now keen for revenge. He's assaulted by tramps and by his former gangmates who have become cops. Finally, the writer he attacked drives him to suicide. But he survives. His treatment is halted, and from now on, he will devote his murderous instincts to serving his country.
It was a prophetic film. And since Stanley is a political beast, as you know, and all his films find in his interest in social politics their common denominator. You can go into The Killing and to Dr. Strangelove and Path of Glory and Clockwork Orange, and you find this right up to the very end. It's always there. The political view, social political view of where do we go, what happens to mankind, how is our future.
Stanley Kubrick, of whom no filmed interviews survive, was born in the Bronx section of New York City in 1928. When he was only 17, he sold a photo he'd made of the death of FDR to Look magazine. For the next 6 years, he completed a number of assignments for the picture magazine, including one about a boxer. This led to his first short film in 1951. In 1955, he shot Killer's Kiss on the streets of New York. His next film, The Killing, renewed the noir genre. Paths of Glory established his reputation as a director. A series of masterpieces followed. Spartacus, Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. By that time, he had settled in England. Unable to find financing for a film about Napoleon, he shot A Clockwork Orange, adapted from a novel by Anthony Burgess.
He fell in love with Anthony Burgess's book. But this falling in love, which I'm using the term deliberately, it's not he liked it. It's not, oh, well, it's quite interesting. No, there had to be a great passion for it before he would go and even consider making it into a film. It's too hard work making a film.
Published in 1962, A Clockwork Orange exercised one of the writer's traumatic memories and expressed his hatred for violence. Alex and his droogs speak a slang called madsat, invented by Burgess. It's based on a mixture of Russian and English, the two languages Burgess felt ruled the world at the time.
The book was about a boy, Huayu, the French call him a young scoundrel, who goes around robbing, killing, and raping, ravaging, and the state catches him and takes him and says, right, we're going to remake you. We're going to use Pavlovian conditioning techniques so that you will respond to evil by feeling ill.
And then, of course, was a huge problem with the cast. Who is going to play this role? Very difficult. You need a brilliant actor, a young, brilliant actor.
Christiana told me the story. She said, do you know how you were cast? And I sort of said, well, I know Stanley told me he'd seen If 5 times. And she said, oh, Malcolm, no, this is the story. I was with Stanley watching when he called for the projection of If. He had a projectionist on standby 24/7. And he'd heard about this film, you know, about the revolution in a boys' school, and he was very anxious to see it. And this is what Christiana told me, is that I made my first entrance in the film, in the first reel, came in dressed like this with the thing and pulled it down, and I'd grown a mustache, you know, and Stanley hit the intercom button. He said, replay that. So replayed it 3 times. Replay that again. And after the 3rd time, he was watching, and he just looked at Christiana and he said, we found our Alex. That was it. I had no idea.
There was no question. There was no other contender for this role. And they got along very well, and I think Malcolm made a major contribution. It was very, very hard to replace him.
He gave me the book, and I'd never heard of it. Clockwork Orange, and then he told me a little bit of the history, that, you know, that it was a cult book. So I read the book once. I didn't understand a word of it, because you had to look up the glossary and all that. And the second time I read it, I thought, this is an extraordinary piece of writing. The 3rd time I read it, I went, it's a great story, it's a great book, and what a great part.
Stanley wrote the film script to Clockwork Orange all by himself. He didn't need anybody else. But he had Anthony Burgess. He had the book. And basically, this was a scissor job. I mean, you cut the sentences out of the book and glue them together. And that's what he did. And he was very, very pleased with it.
But suddenly I vidded that thinking was for the gloopy ones, and that the omni ones used like inspiration and what bogs ends. For now it was lovely music that came to my aid. There was a window open with a stereo on, and I vidded right at once what to do.
We wanted to have something futuristic. Stanley wanted, in Clockwork Orange, obviously buildings that are not showing 1971, but be as modern as possible. He would have loved Le Corbusier-style concrete things, which we didn't have. But you had the equivalent of very futuristic, concrete, cold, ugly, 90-degree sort of buildings. The dressing had to be made. That didn't exist. So we had to go and design elements like these women in the milk bar. I mean, that didn't exist. That had to be done.
When the film was released, this was pre-punk, punk, rock, the funny music and the bands, the way they dressed. And I think Clockwork Orange kind of might have influenced punk somewhat in the way people dressed or wanted to dress and their style, whatever. So that was kind of crazy. I had no choice in what I was going to wear, but I said, yeah, put on me what you wish. It doesn't matter. Stanley and the designer would just say, let's try Warren in this, or let's try Malcolm in this, and you'd go for it, and there the costume would be on you, and that's it.
I had my cricket gear in the car, and I was telling him, and he said, show me. So I put on the cricket, white trousers, white shirt, and then he saw the protector, and he said, put that on the outside. He said, that looks kind of cool. It looks like a codpiece. It's got the sort of Middle Ages. And we were laughing, and he took pictures. So that's basically how the costume was formed, the basis. It was my cricket whites. The hat, well, there was a big box of hats that Milena Canonero had, and I wanted to use, of course, the symbol of the City of London, which is the symbol of the establishment, is the bowler hat. So that's why I chose a bowler hat. The eyelash was from, I was walking up Church Street in London, and there was this boutique called Biba. It became a big thing, you know, Mary Quant and all that. But they had a yard of eyelash, which I thought was very funny and amusing, and I thought Stanley would like it as a joke. And I showed it to him, and he said, oh, put it on. I went, no, not for me. He went, yes, put it on. So I stuck it on one eye. He photographed it. I put it on both. He photographed it. The next day, he called me, and he said, it's very strange. I got the pictures back. He said, of the eyelash. And I said, oh, yeah, how did it look? He goes, it's amazing. The one eyelash, it looks, you look at your face and you think there's something weird, but you can't tell what it is.
C'est surtout quand on va à Tokyo qu'on pense souvent à Orange Mécanique. J'ai même vu des filles dans des boîtes de nuit se maquiller avec des fossiles d'un côté, comme le personnage de l'Orange Mécanique. Je me dis, mais attends, mais tu me fais penser au personnage de l'Orange Mécanique. Ouais, c'est ça. Et après, le truc, c'est qu'il y a plein de fois où je me suis retrouvé chez des gens que je connaissais ou que je connaissais pas. Et au-dessus du lit, qu'est-ce qu'il y a comme affiche? Il y a l'affiche de l'Orange Mécanique. C'est un film référence ultime pour plein de gens.
I think it was just a breakthrough film, and people have a hard time watching it today. I mean, women are not going to want to see a woman raped. Women are not going to want to see the cat lady beaten up by a penis. Old people are not going to want to see an old man who's lost his home drunk in an alleyway get kicked to pieces. So it's still a violent film, but it wasn't made to be a violent film. It was made to be prophetic. It was made to be, this is where we're going if we're not careful. So it appealed, it was perfect in the 70s. I mean, England in the 60s and 70s was a major breakthrough country anyway, with the Beatles and all the music and Carnaby Street. I mean, it became the fashionable place for rebellion. Rebellion in clothing, rebellion in makeup, rebellion in smoking and drinking.
Les années 60 et 70, c'est vraiment un incroyable moment de libéralisation des mœurs et de libéralisation de manière générale qui est incarnée par sa jeunesse. Les sociétés occidentales prennent un coup de jeune, mais ça provoque fatalement de la part d'autres forces de la société une peur et des discours qui vont réagir, se méfier et qui vont accuser ce mouvement juvénile d'être facteur de désordre. Cette peur-là est quelque chose qui continue à travailler nos sociétés aujourd'hui et qui est particulièrement bien mise en exergue dans Orange Mécanique.
A wave of anxiety about crime swept Western Europe in the early 1970s. It was a post-war phenomenon resulting from the conjunction of massive urbanization and the rise of the middle classes. Widespread feelings of resentment focused on juvenile delinquency, which greatly increased over the continent between 1945 and 1970.
In England at that period, it was evident that there was a new kind of violence coming into the world, and this was a violence engineered by youth. We had gangs, we had the opposition between the mods and the rockers. These gangs had various names, and we've ended up with groups like the skinheads and the punk groups and so on. It seemed that there was a world movement coming, which consisted in youth being dissatisfied and not being able to create, so having to destroy.
C'est l'aspect lutte de classe sociale au fond. C'est quand même les délinquants qui sont des enfants de prolétaires et qui s'en prennent aux riches, aux bourgeois. Chose qu'on retrouve également dans le discours, par exemple, des jeunes blousons noirs en France qui sortent le soir se faire un bourgeois.
Ils frappent les vieillards sans défense, ils violent les femmes, ils sont une bande qui peut faire tous les actes sexuels possibles. Les corps ne sont que des objets. Plus quelqu'un est pitoyable et victime, plus on va le frapper. Enfin, c'est la jouissance du mal, à l'état pur.
We had to do a scene which is really the most crucial scene in the movie. And it's the most crucial in the book. It is the reason for the movie and the book. You know, the rape of the wife of the writer, you know, who goes on to write A Clockwork Orange. So it's very important, you know, and we just sat there because there was no scene. And really, how do you do it? And now, by this time, I was really bored, and it was just really sheer luck. Stanley came over and he said, "Can you dance?" And so just for fun, I went, "Yeah, absolutely," and just went into the whole thing as a complete improv, kicking, slapping, to Singing in the Rain.
So for the first half hour of him doing that, I was in hysterics. I was laughing my head off because it was just so ridiculous. But we did it, and it was quite an unbelievable scene.
It's one of those magical moments that you say thank you, and you can't intellectualize it. It just happens.
Right, Pete, check the rest of the house. 10.
Stanley calls me and he says, "We figured it out." I said, "What?" He said, we need a recording of Singing in the Rain." I said, "For what?" He said, "Well, this is the way we're going to do the scene." I said, "With Malcolm kicking a guy, singing in the rain, kick." I said, "God, Gene Kelly's going to die." And I said, "We don't have the rights, Stanley. We're never going to get the rights for this." He said, "Well, that's what I want."
It was the perfect metaphor, because Singing in the Rain, as Gene Kelly did it so beautifully in the movie, you know, it is Hollywood's vision of euphoria given to the world. And so Alex is at his most euphoric, you know, he's leader of the gang doing nasty things. And so it worked perfectly.
Walk down the lane with a happy refrain.
A year later, I was invited to come to Hollywood to meet with the studio executives and talk about the film and all the rest of it. And my minder from Warner Brothers said, "Oh, there's a party tonight. There'll be a lot of movie stars. Would you like to go?" And I went, "Yes, I would love to meet some movie stars." You know, I was a lad from England. And so we went into this party. I don't know whose house, and the guy came. He goes, "Oh, Malcolm, this is exciting." He goes, "Gene Kelly's here. Would you like to meet him?" And I went, "Oh, yes, I'd love to meet him." And so he tapped him. He was facing away from me. He tapped him on the back, and he turned. He said, "Mr. Kelly, I'd like to introduce you to Malcolm McDowell." He looked at me like, and he just turned away and walked away.
He said, there are films where people are being visually, clearly killed and the blood is flowing. I have taken all the murders and put them in cartoon form with drawings and with symbolism. And the only really cruel scene comes from his friends, the policemen who hold his head underwater. That actually is really awful. The other scenes are not shown that clearly. They're more like a stylized ballet. It's all shot in bright colors like cartoons, and the murder is done with a sculpture.
C'est psychédélique, c'est surréaliste. Il y a tous les objets, mais il n'y a pas d'acte sexuel visible à l'écran. Et c'est là où le cinéma a changé. Et le génie de Kubrick, c'est d'avoir montré un film d'un esthétisme absolument inouï, d'un élitisme très grand. C'est le contraire du réalisme. Et c'est ça qui est bien.
What you imagine, you see, can be much, much stronger than what you see. And so this is the art of a painter or of a filmmaker, to relate to the audience and make the audience see even if they don't see it. So yes, you're right. On Alexander, you just see him having this ping pong ball in his mouth and the tape and his eyes. But this is much more violent than to film what you think he sees. But that's called filmmaking.
I wasn't particularly interested in the violence. I was interested in what governments would do about the violence. And there was a good deal of talk in Britain at that time, and also in America 21 years ago, that these young thugs, these young wayu, they should be taken over and conditioned so as to be unable to perform violent acts. They should undergo a period of Pavlovian brainwashing, which should make them into good citizens. Of course, this struck me as being, this was my Christianity coming out, saying this was totally evil because we would be depriving these kids, these youngsters, of freedom of choice.
What's the hypo for, then? Gonna send me to sleep?
Oh, no, nothing of the sort.
Vitamins, will it be, then?
Something like that. You're a little undernourished, so after each meal, we're going to give you a shot. Roll over on your right side, please. Loosen your pajama pants and pull them halfway down.
What exactly is the treatment here going to be, then?
Oh, it's quite simple, really. We're just going to show you some films.
You mean like going to the pictures?
Something like that.
And by taking him over and brainwashing him, of course, he becomes not an individual human soul, but a Clockwork Orange, a kind of organism which has been fitted with a clockwork device, which makes him respond to the touch of a button or the touch of a switch.
Ce sont ces traitements-là qui sont appliqués partout, notamment dans le monde anglophone. C'est ce qu'on appelle les thérapies comportementales, appliquées essentiellement d'ailleurs aux criminels pervers, où en effet ça consiste à leur montrer des images effrayantes, à les conditionner comme des animaux, on fait même plus ça pour les animaux, pour essayer de leur extirper leur vice en quelque sorte. Et non seulement ça ne marche pas, le film le montre très bien parce que c'est cyclique. Ils reviennent au point, ils reviennent au début de ce qu'ils sont, mais c'est pire parce que quand un État ou un corps professionnel, en l'occurrence le pouvoir judiciaire ou le pouvoir d'État, devient pervers, aussi pervers que le criminel, alors c'est bien pire parce qu'on passe de la perversion individuelle à la perversion d'État.
Mind control techniques were researched in the mid-20th century by totalitarian regimes. The lobotomy experiments of Nazi surgeons and the imprisonment of Soviet dissidents in the 60s were efforts to give the state ultimate power over the individual's thoughts. Conditioning therapy practiced by communist regimes inspired Western psychiatrists who combined the technique with powerful psychoactive drugs.
C'est le grand moment, rappelons-le, de la dénonciation de la violence d'État, de la violence policière, de la violence de ce qu'on appelle à l'époque les institutions totalitaires, en particulier la prison. Ce sera beaucoup, en France, le thème principal, avec sa figure intellectuelle emblématique, Michel Foucault, mais en Angleterre, c'est beaucoup plus l'institution psychiatrique, sachant que l'Angleterre est vraiment le bastion du mouvement antipsychiatrique.
In the 60s and 70s, the philosopher Michel Foucault and the anti-psychiatry movement led by R.D. Laing and David Cooper sharply criticized social institutions in democratic countries. They saw medicine, psychiatry, and even education as orthodoxies which could be used to control people and spy on them instead of instructing and liberating them. Their anti-establishment ideas were widely acclaimed in Europe.
Like many intellectuals, Stanley was anti most establishments because they have such faults. He was rebellious against the mistakes within each government, in each justice system. At the same time, and this is why the story is interesting, he knew that if you get rid of this, what are you going to replace it with? None of us know. It's the eternal question, what would you rather have? A mob with no rules at all, or some vicious dictator? It's almost equal.
You have an ever-increasing feeling among young people that politics and legal means of social change are too slow and maybe useless. On the other hand, you have authority that feels threatened by terrorism and this growing sense of anarchy that they can feel. And the question is, how do you achieve, if it's possible anymore, some kind of balance? I don't know the answer. It certainly doesn't lie in this very utopian sort of optimistic view that if you destroy authority, then something good will come of it. And it certainly, and equally, it doesn't lie by saying, you know, authority must impose its will with greater and greater force. It's a dilemma.
Ce qui est très 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 moderne chez Kubrick, c'est qu'il traite de ce pouvoir-là, justement dans les pays démocratiques, et pas du tout dans un pays totalitaire. Autrement dit, ça nous semble encore plus dangereux, puisque normalement, ces méthodes-là n'auraient pas dû envahir les pays démocratiques. Or, elles l'ont envahi. Quand on voyait il y a 40 ans, on se disait, mais c'est imaginaire, ça ne peut pas arriver, c'est futuriste. Et en fait, c'est arrivé et c'est même généralisé, d'autant que les États s'occupent aujourd'hui beaucoup plus, et c'est ça aussi le changement, de cette idéologie sécuritaire, et notamment en ce qui concerne les crimes récidivants de pervers qui jouissent de leur acte criminel.
Stanley showed me a picture, of this patient with these lid locks. And I sort of looked at it and went, oh, how nice, you know. He said, no, take a real good look, because I want you to do that. And I went, I'm not going to do this. He went, oh, yeah, you have to do it. I went, Stanley, no way. Are you kidding? That's in the eyes. He went, we'll get a doctor, you know.
I got a gentleman from Moorfields Eye Hospital called Dr. Gundry to come and put these clips in. And he said to Stanley, Stanley, I have to stand over this actor. I don't care where I stand, but I've got to be in a position where every 20 seconds I can drop eye drops into each eye. If I don't do that, his eyes are going to dry up, he's going to damage his cornea, and then we have a really serious problem. We had done many, many takes to the point where Malcolm just couldn't take it any longer. And he just screamed. And as he screamed, he tried to rip his arms out of the straitjacket. And as he did it, he hit the clip, which scraped his cornea.
Because I had an anesthetic, I couldn't feel it until I got home, when the anesthetic wore off. And then I've never known such pain ever. In fact, my doctor, who lived around the corner in Kensington, came over and shot me with morphine. It was very physically demanding, you know. It was a very physical film, but, you know, I was young, big deal, you know.
Oh, you see that? Is that you? Well, I want you to lick it. Go on! Lick it.
And oh my brothers, would you believe your faithful friend and long-suffering narrator pushed out his red Yazzik 1.5 miles to lick the Grasny Vonny boots?
It's a story about brainwashing, and the only way we're going to deal with brainwashing is to fix their brains. That in itself is a crime. That in itself is violent. So that's why Alex, the character, wins in the end, because the government gets they get showed up that they're doing something which is inhumane.
Alex. No, I wouldn't say he's positive. I would just say that there's this strange psychological identification with him. It's probably what attracted me to the book, is this strange duality of a character who is plainly evil, and yet because of him operating on this unconscious level, makes you aware of things in your own personality which you then identify with him.
J'ai pas le sentiment que Kubrick trouve que Alex est un personnage positif. On passe évidemment de l'abjection à la compassion, puisqu'il est lui-même victime de ce qu'il avait. Mais ce que je trouve très fort dans le film, c'est qu'à aucun moment on ne peut s'identifier à l'un des personnages, puisque chacun est tantôt une victime, tantôt un bourreau.
If you meet somebody who's truly bad, as Alex is, of course he chooses Beethoven, because Beethoven is fun and emotional, and you know, a good taste in music doesn't make you a good person, as we know. And the excitable element of Beethoven he uses as a drug.
I mean, Stanley was himself a great music lover, and he knew how important it was to find music for his films that help the audience to relate to the image they see on the screen. Now, on Clockwork Orange, of course, the Beethoven Symphony was given by Anthony Burgess. It's part of the book.
And it's a very important key to the character, because, you know, as Stanley said, you know, anyone who can love Beethoven can't be all that bad.
One thing he always said very, very clearly is that the biggest problem is that we as a species live under the illusion that we are governed by our ability to think rationally, that we are governed by our knowledge, by our education, by our ability to think analytically. It's not true. We are governed by our emotions. Whenever something happens, which is drastic. In a case of panic, I mean, the brain goes totally out, and we're acting very irrationally. And he didn't exclude himself. And he found this house here, and it was in '79. I was extremely happy. He had enough room for all his stuff. He was a great reader. He was reading all the time, and he liked to stay in his house and be on the top floor in his room, reading or watching tennis or whatever. Yeah, people came to him. You see, he was a very social man. It's not true that he was withdrawn, and he just didn't go into pub.
He didn't like interviews because he may have said something silly, or he may say something weird, and then people would have a different opinion of him. So he avoided them. And of course, the more he avoided them, the more they were attracted to Stanley. You know, who's the real Stanley?
He often is described as somebody who was terribly vain and pompous. I mean, really the opposite is true. He just wasn't at all. And meanwhile, there are also lots of people who have said that is not true. And the fact that he was a recluse, I can only laugh. They were really not.
He had a great sense of humor, very black, which tapped into my own. So we'd be sitting there at 3 in the morning in the middle of some sequence, and suddenly we'd start laughing. You know, when I was doing the sequence at the end in the hospital with the minister, and he's feeding me, I got bored with this actor, and I just suddenly went like this, and Stanley had to leave. He was laughing so hard. He was crying. He had his handkerchief stuffed in his mouth. He was crying.
I can tell you with all sincerity that I and the government of which I'm a member are deeply sorry about this, my boy. Deeply sorry. We tried to help you. We followed recommendations which were made to us that turned out to be wrong. An inquiry will place the responsibility where it belongs. We want you to regard us as friends.
He didn't talk about character. I mean, that was not Stanley's way. Stanley, when I asked him once, have you got any ideas about this scene? He looked at me and he said, gee, Malk, I'm not RADA. RADA being the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, which is a drama school. So he wasn't there to teach me how to act. I wasn't asking him that, by the way. I was asking him if he had any ideas about the scene.
I think there were moments when Malcolm was frustrated because he would want some feedback from Stanley, and he wouldn't always get it. Stanley would just say, let's do another, try it a little different, come in from that side.
And then I understood, and I said to him, now I know why you like working with Peter Sellers, because he'll do 40 different voices and 40 different characters, and you know, you can choose. And he said, that's right, that's right.
Directing a movie, if you try to do it properly, is not always fun, because you are in conflict with people, even on a subtle level. I mean, I saw Woody Allen interviewed. He found that working with other actors as a director, he said, no matter how calm it all is, and no matter how it's accepted, he said, you can always see in their eyes the resentment of being told anything. And of course, that's always true. I find the writing of the thing and the editing of the thing immensely enjoyable. The shooting of the thing is sometimes enjoyable.
He was a perfectionist, and he was also an innovator. Always experimenting. I mean, if you look at all his films, they're all different. He liked challenges. He liked to... Stanley loved pre-production. He didn't like filming as much, but he loved pre-production because that's when he could spend a year. He could spend 2 years because he wasn't spending much money. And he would get into all the information of whatever project he was making. And he used to love that, getting to know knowledge time. He'd become an expert.
In most of his films, you will find that he tries new ways of showing an extraordinary image. I mean, in The Shining, you have the use of the Steadicam for the first time in a big way and get a very special effect. In Barry Lyndon, you have the very fast lens to shoot candlelight. And in Clockwork Orange, indeed, he liked to operate the camera as long as it was possible to hold it. But even if he didn't operate it himself, he was totally involved in the setups, in the choice of lenses. For example, he loved in Clockwork Orange to use the Kinoptic 9.8mm lens for close-ups in tiny little rooms, which distorts everything.
The more control you get, the more you prevent other people from preventing you from doing the right things. It doesn't guarantee you're going to do the right things, but it certainly stops other people from throwing you off your balance and from, well, let's take in the case of foreign dubbing. I mean, if you let the major studios do it the way they want to, the dubbing is done very quickly with cheap actors, and it's never good. It spoils the film.
When I first met him, he went over here and he gave me a US Navy rule book. And I said, what's that for? He said, look up Rule 268 or whatever it was. He said, now read it to me. So I read it. And this is not the exact words, but basically it said, the duty of the sub-lieutenant is to never argue to the captain in front of crew, to support him 100%, never to talk behind his back without him knowing, and so on. He said those are the rules of the captain and his sub-lieutenant. Those are the rules I want you to be with me.
Clockwork Orange for me was the first film, so I observed this. I didn't know how extraordinary it was that he afterwards got involved in the design of the ads and the whole promotion and how it was released. For example, Clockwork Orange was released by playing it only in very few cities, and then slowly it was building up. Yes, he very much controlled the cinemas and discussed it with Warner Brothers. It's not that he was running the release. Of course not, he couldn't possibly, but he consulted all the time with Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers also listened to him.
Un des aspects fascinants de Kubrick pour tous les jeunes réalisateurs, c'est que il a dompté ce cheval qu'on dit indomptable, qui est qui sont les studios hollywoodiens.
I don't think Stanley was fazed by too many things, because he was in control. I think he controlled God when he was making the film. He was God. Stanley was God, with that big beard. And Stanley was God.
Clockwork Orange hit British cinemas in December 1971. Like all of Kubrick's films, it provoked debate. The New York film critics gave it their Best Film Award. Made with a budget of $2 million, it earned $14 million, making it one of Kubrick's most profitable films. However, the film was immediately surrounded by controversy. Certain British MPs were ready to ban the film.
I was very disappointed in the reaction, because all they talked about was basically the violence of the piece, which really was an excuse not to really talk about what the film was about. It was just the surface, rather than what the film was really about.
He was very much attacked by showing, for example, this rape, so incredibly vicious, a vicious rape. His attitude is that if you show a rape, it better be vicious. And if people find it is absolutely disgusting, right, well spotted, it is. Yeah, well, you should be disgusted by it. I think he's a man of great principle here.
There might have been 2 or 3 decent critics, but a lot of them were just looking at it as a violent film. And also then the government got involved. Why? I don't know, but they did. And Reginald Maudling, who was the Home Secretary at the time, tried to have the film banned, but it wasn't banned.
A few months after Clockwork Orange came out, the press reported on a series of assaults and murders committed by English teenagers who said they were copying Alex in the film. Kubrick was targeted as a proponent of violence, and the picture was blamed for the problems of English society. The tabloids screamed that movies were the cause of the crime wave. In fact, several films with scenes of extreme violence had just been released. Sam Peckinpah's Wild Bunch and Dirty Harry, directed by Don Siegel.
C'est au fond toujours la même idée, hein, et la même incapacité à comprendre que les productions artistiques, quelles qu'elles soient, sont des témoignages et sont des miroirs d'une époque, et qu'il ne faut absolument pas leur prêter une telle influence sur des gens qui seraient décérébrés et à qui on viendrait inculquer au fond ceci. C'est le contraire.
That started to freak Stanley out because that's not what he made the movie for. And he did not want to be seen as a man who encouraged violence, not at all.
He expected that there would be some attacks, but mild and small, and that there would be a lot of defense of the film. He was very shocked when it turned into a complete rampage.
I think there was also a personal thing there because he was starting to get all sorts of weird guys calling the house or coming by the house, and he's worried about his wife and his 3 children.
And then the police came, and the police had several letters and several things. He said, "You're now under real threat. We must protect you." So then he got on the phone and asked Warner Brothers. He said, "I can't live here anymore because it's really becoming appalling. And can I pull the film?"
Anyway, it had a big run, and a very successful run already. So Warner Brothers clearly thought, well, it was much more important to them to have a good relationship with Stanley Kubrick rather than whether the film plays in the UK or not. It's not that important. I mean, the rest of the world, the film was incredibly successful.
So Stanley withdrew it and forever, until he died.
So that creates a cult. I mean, they showed it in universities, colleges. It became something to watch and analyze, because what was behind it? What were the messages? How does it relate to today?
And it was deemed to be a work of art, and it became a cult movie. And the only time people could see it in England is if they bought a pirate copy in Amsterdam or Paris or Berlin and brought it back with them, video. So it wasn't widely seen in England at all until after Stanley's death, when the film was re-released and then it was seen on television. And the reactions it received were sort of mild, really, not shock, not, "Oh, my God, this is terrible." It's like, oh, yeah, okay, mainly because I think that the society in England had become used to that kind of person in their life, that sort of mad young teenager who could do anything.
I remember seeing the movie when it first came out in America. Nobody laughed at anything. I thought, my God, they hate the film. They must hate it. But when I see the audience now, 40 years later, or I saw it 2 or 3 years ago with a young audience, they laughed at everything. And suddenly, the comedy has been set free from the film, because we're not so worried about the violence. I mean, it's nothing. You see more on television.
After Clockwork Orange, Stanley Kubrick made 4 more films: Barry Lyndon, Shining, Full Metal Jacket, and Eyes Wide Shut, his 13th and final feature. On March 7th, 1999, a few days after he finished editing that film, Kubrick died at the age of 70 in the manor house where he had settled 20 years earlier. He's buried on the estate. 1 year after his death, Clockwork Orange was re-released in English cinemas after having been withdrawn at Kubrick's request since 1974. An artist who was solitary and a perfectionist, a pessimistic visionary who crafted both experimental films and blockbusters, Stanley Kubrick influenced a generation of filmmakers.
I produced 21 movies, and I've worked on a total of 58 movies. And Stanley is unique. I'm not saying that because of his interview. I miss him. He was a slave driver, impossible at some times. but the reward was incredible. And I've never met a director like him.
It was a very intense relationship that I had with him, and very close. And I feel that maybe I scared him, that I got too close to him. And I think it scared him. He didn't like anyone to be too close. I mean, I'm not talking about his family, but I'm talking about working. We were great friends. I mean, you could not be but great friends when you work together every day for a year and go through this amazing journey of Alex Delage. Great journey.